this for me?
Your choice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, and to members of council, thank you as well for the opportunity. I am honored to share kind of my thoughts, the administration's thoughts on the issue of Amendment 64 in Denver, Colorado. I'll tell you that before I get started with my prepared remarks, that this framework that we'll share with you, some of the points that I think are important, are not without a great deal of conversation and forethought with regards to really the obligation that we as a city have, or leaders have, to the people of the city, but also to Amendment 64 following the November election and the people of Colorado having spoken. As mayor of this great city, I believe all of our, as elected officials, number one priority is to keep our people safe, healthy, and to protect our neighborhoods. The passage of Amendment 64 is unprecedented, and many fundamental federal, state, and local questions remain unanswered. We know, for example, that Amendment 64 violates the Federal Controlled Substances Act, and that anyone who knowingly facilitates the cultivation, sale, or distribution of marijuana risks prosecution. Federal regulators prohibit financial institutions from providing services to marijuana dispensaries. Any transaction involving funds from the marijuana industry would constitute money laundering. Therefore, the Colorado banking industry cannot offer any services to legal marijuana businesses in our state. While that protects our banks, the owners of these businesses, while risking prosecution at the federal level for operating in the first place, are forced to operate on a cash basis, which increases their risk of being burglarized and raises the crime rates in our neighborhoods. Even though we prefer not to talk about it, those cash operations also open a door to an illegal element in our city and our state. The situation also makes it much more difficult to regulate and enforce our laws. While we have sought guidance on Amendment 64 from the federal government, the Department of Justice has not indicated whether or not, or to what extent, it will weigh in. Denver is nonetheless required under Amendment 64 to move forward with our own local response despite harboring such very real concerns. Now, the state continues to work hard to quickly construct a regulatory structure for the new law, as recommended in last month's task force report. My administration generally supports the task force's overall plan, as stated in my recent letter to Representative Dan Pabon, which was shared with City Council and the Denver delegation, and will work with our state partners to craft a rigorous, comprehensive, and transparent regulatory framework. As the recent state audit found, however, regulating a new and unsanctioned industry is not an easy task. The State Medical Marijuana Enforcement Division has faced tremendous challenges in trying to effectively regulate marijuana. And now that same agency is being asked to regulate recreational marijuana usage. It's a tall order on a tight time frame. We have been waiting to see the details of the state implementing legislation in order to understand the full scope of our local regulatory authority, should we decide to issue licenses in Denver. That draft legislation was to be released today and will, I believe, be key to our ability to manage adult recreational marijuana at the city level. We do look forward to reviewing it and to continue working with our state partners to craft a system that works. We believe that the regulatory structure proposed by the task force was beginning to move the state in the right direction by providing a workable framework if Denver officials decide to allow licensing in our city. But before we can responsibly agree to opt into this new environment, we must see clearly that the state has demonstrated its ability to adopt laws it can enforce, and that the adequate resources have been allocated for regulation and enforcement. Now, I want to salute City Council and the leadership of Councilman Charlie Brown in crafting a regulatory system for medical marijuana. I sat in these very chairs at the same time we did that several years ago. And for taking the time to grapple with our new reality. We stand with you as Denver continues to be responsible and thorough in considering the issues that surround Amendment 64. At the state level, a satisfactory regulatory framework is essential. Adequate resources provided by taxes and fees must be allocated to assure proper licensing, enforcement, and education, as well as multi-jurisdictional tracking of inventory. Consumer safety must be addressed, including safeguards around edible products, packaging, and labeling requirements. Revisions to the criminal code will be necessary to protect our children and clarify the many unanswered questions, including what constitutes public consumption and whether private marijuana clubs will be prohibited. We appreciate the recommendations of the task force report concerning local control of marijuana businesses, which ensure that municipalities can exercise full authority to regulate marijuana businesses within their respective jurisdictions in terms of time, place, manner, and number. We have urged the state to expressly acknowledge the implementing legislation, the authority of local governments to require a separate license in addition to the license issued by the state. If Denver should opt in, we support the task force concept of a phase-in period of at least 2 years, during which only existing medical marijuana licensees can apply for licenses under the state law. We anticipate that a substantial number of our existing 200 licensed medical marijuana centers in Denver, plus those licensed for cultivation and manufacturing, will seek to convert to adult use as allowed by Amendment 64. State and local regulatory authorities must have ample time to manage this initial surge of licensing before opening the door to new applicants. We must also consider how we will license those businesses and wish to remain medical marijuana dispensaries if we move to an adult use model. Now, while the city will be watching and working closely with our state partners to draft a regulatory framework, we must be prepared to design comprehensive, transparent, and rigorous enforcement and licensing policies at the local level. Of paramount concern to me is the need to protect the integrity of our neighborhoods. We have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of our residents. We must honor their voices by allowing them to be heard through a meaningful public hearing process before any adult retail marijuana business is allowed to become part of any one of our neighborhoods. This consideration creates rigorous standards to protect neighborhoods before any medical marijuana business is allowed to convert to the new licensing. We must also ensure that the retail marijuana stores are not allowed near schools or near other retail marijuana stores. Now, because I am proud of this city and fully intend to maintain our reputation among the world's great municipalities, I will not support public consumption of marijuana in our streets or our parks or anywhere else our population might be unwittingly exposed. I will also not support the establishment of private clubs in Denver. Amendment 64 does not provide for this, and neither should we. I will support a funding structure that pays for itself. Recreational marijuana will cost us plenty as we move to license new and existing businesses. As we enforce new laws, it will also take a toll on our public health budgets. The state task force has recommended 2 types of state taxes on the marijuana industry. We are advocating for a local share of that revenue without or with no preemption of local taxation. While Denver has not yet adopted a special marijuana tax on commercial medical marijuana businesses, my administration, I will tell you, is open to considering local marijuana taxation to assure that the recreational marijuana industry pays for itself. We should allow for funding of anti-drug education efforts once and only once our regulatory and enforcement obligations are met. We must craft a system that does not take funding from our city's other priorities to support recreational marijuana businesses. It has to pay for itself. Now, let me just share with you in summary what I just recommended. A phase-in period of at least 2 years during which only existing medical marijuana licensees can apply for licenses under the law. Rigorous standards to protect our neighborhoods. Meaningful public hearing process. Ensuring that any new retail marijuana stores are not allowed near schools or near other marijuana outlets, and a funding structure that pays for itself. We will not support public consumption of marijuana in our streets or our parks or anywhere else our population might be exposed. And we will not support the establishment of private clubs. Finally, as everyone who has touched this subject of late will attest, there are no easy answers to what we are facing. Amendment 64 calls for a quick implementation, but we cannot sacrifice excellence for expediency. Our children's future depends upon us and the actions we take now. As a parent, I can tell you, and I have to admit, to worrying about how the increased presence of marijuana in our city will affect our children and our grandchildren. Despite a few lessons learned from medical marijuana, the long-term implications of that industry and the potential for an expanded industry will not be known to us, perhaps, for a generation or more. There is no denying, however, the potential for the negative impact on our kids, on their home lives, their health, their education, and their future. We already know the toll substance abuse takes on so many of our residents. Sadly, many of them are parents. The cost of substance abuse on our healthcare system, our jails, and our courts is substantial. I want more for all of our kids and for our Denverites. We are making those investments right now in our kids. And I encourage all of us responsible to this great city and to the great people who live here to step back and to take an honest look at the implications of Amendment 64 and allow ourselves the time to make good decisions and good policy based on good facts. The voters spoke in November, and we respect that. They also voted at an earlier time for us to represent them and consider their best interests. I believe they expect us to assume our responsibilities to the best of our abilities and make wise decisions before we move to implement a law that goes contrary to federal legislation, something untried, and with the ability to alter the Denver of the future. Again, Mr. Chairman Brown, thank you for the opportunity to come see you, and to my colleagues or counterparts on City Council, thank you as well for the opportunity to come before you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm sure there will be some questions. We'll start with Jeannie Fox.
Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilwoman Fox.
You talked about the regulatory framework and basically the revenue sources needing to be adequate.
Right.
If you were to determine these were inadequate, would you ever even contemplate banning conversion or any other kind of movement?
Councilwoman Fox, good question, and quite frankly, that's why we believe it's important that we have a managed 2-year phase-in process. We need to understand what the impacts are, not only in our community, but also as a unit of government responsible for not only regulating but enforcing the laws around Amendment 64 and protecting the integrity of our communities. And that's why a managed rollout process, one in which we're able to very carefully analyze the impact, the costs associated with the law and its enforcement and regulation will be very important here. You know, if it was up to me, you know that it will be a different ballgame. But the reality is that people have spoken, and we want to do this in a way in which it does not impact Denver's ability to deliver on other priorities.
Susan?
There's a question that's been, thank you, Mayor, by the way, for being here.
You bet.
There's a question that's been rolling around in my head for a long time, and that's around the private club issue. And I guess I'm just curious, you know, why you might be taking a stance against that, and I will tell you why I've been thinking about this. And we heard Tammy Dora talk about issues around public consumption, and my thought on this is, if for whatever reason you cannot consume in your own home or on your own property, but you still intend to consume, if you don't have a place to go and do it legally, so to speak, your only other alternative perhaps is to do it outside. I don't know if there's any research on this, but I think this is a really important question to think through. For whatever reason, I think there's a lot of people that will not be able to consume on their own property. So it just, to me, it seems like if there wasn't another place to go, that they might be more tempted to consume outside. So I'm just throwing that out there for your response and for other people's consideration.
Again, we remind ourselves that we're still dealing with a federally controlled substance. In fact, our local law enforcement authorities are just now really figuring out how to best measure and determine that someone is operating a vehicle under, a controlled substance, or marijuana for that matter, more specifically. I don't believe it is wise to open the door even wider for people to move about our public from a private club to their private home while consuming marijuana. And the more we restrict it, to me, the better, more safe our community will be. And it's just, there's no reason why we need to open up that Pandora's box when the law doesn't speak to it. And it's simply, I propose and advocate for the most restrictive regulatory environment for marijuana. And I believe that by allowing for private clubs, it doesn't speak to that value.
Okay, thank you.
Paul?
Thank you, Charlie. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here. I really appreciated your speech. On the issue of spacing between one shop and another and between schools, when we had this discussion with the medical marijuana licenses, you and I were very adamant about making sure that there's spacing, one, so that neighborhoods don't all get overrun by the same use, but also so that there's competitiveness. For the retail side, what is it that you are wanting to see happen in terms of how many feet away from each other, away from schools? What are your thoughts? I'm just curious, the specifics of what you believe you'd like to see.
One of the things we're looking at, and I'm certainly very curious to the City Council's point of view, and I do remember you and I very clearly arguing for as far as the distance between each other and the schools as possible, and that still remains. I don't know why 1,500 feet continues to pop into my head, but if we start with the current dispensaries, I believe it's less than that. It's 1,000 feet, right? And so then let's start there. And again, within the 2 years, let's manage, let's see how it impacts. Again, let's use this as a chance to evaluate really the impacts in our communities and on the various surrounding stakeholders.
And if I may follow up, Mr. Chair, I appreciate that Liberty involved council with that as well too in that decision. I joke around a lot with this, and District 3 in the West Side doesn't have one coffee shop until a couple weeks ago, and it sits at the site of a former liquor license that we had to fight very hard to get out of town. Now, MMJ and retail liquor license and Mad Dog aren't the same thing. We know that. And in that way, in that area, I truly believe that there is a difference. And I truly believe that alcohol, I enjoy my beer in front of a Bronco game like everybody else, but too much of it can kill you and can kill a neighborhood. We know that a lot. There's a complete difference between the two. However, we've had that problem in the West Side. We've killed 6 of these kind of licenses that were nuisance licenses because we haven't been able to actually breathe in that district in our only little areas where there's commercial areas, because that was the only use. And a person shouldn't have to fight, a neighborhood shouldn't have to fight so much every year just to get their point across that they want a coffee shop and not a liquor store. So I want to make sure that the biggest problem I have is it's measured not as a crow's flight, but as you walk across the street. So that 1,000 feet can literally be 1,000 or almost across the street from each other on Federal Boulevard.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that is still there. We're going to tackle the liquor license thing, but I want to make sure that we're given a fair shot to do the same thing again in a respectable way in our neighborhoods.
And Councilman Lopez, I'll tell you that and my staff will tell you that I talked about kids and integrity of neighborhoods the entire time we're talking through and fleshing out these policies. The reality is that I want to make sure that communities, neighborhoods, residents of neighborhoods have the opportunity to weigh in. If you have an MMD that has not been a good actor in the community, you're going to have an opportunity to weigh in following their attempts to convert, their application to convert. The reality is that, again, let's take 2 years. Let's see how this process works. Let's not inundate ourselves with something new that we don't know about. It was the same way when we started MMD. We led the nation, really, in this because of Councilman Brown's leadership. We led the state, quite frankly, down this road. And while we continue to wait kind of for their regulatory framework, I hope that we keep in the front of our, back and front of our minds here in Denver, protect the neighborhoods. I believe in my heart that having recreational retail operations will be much different than having MMD operations in our neighborhoods.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I have been struggling with this issue that you touched on about neighborhood input because it seems like the right thing to do in theory, but I think the concern I hear from proponents sometimes is isn't this just a backdoor way of ensuring that, neighborhoods come out and kill all of the conversions or all of the licenses? And so what I've been struggling with is what are the criteria and how would it maybe be different than the liquor needs and desires hearing? Because I guess because it is still illegal federally, I'm trying to figure out who comes to testify and say, yep, I want that marijuana in my neighborhood. I don't know how you demonstrate the need. So that's I want to get there, but I didn't know if your administration has had any tossing around of potential criteria.
Well, we obviously we tossed around and talked about some things, but really what I hope to do is in partnership with City Council and the communities, quite frankly, do that. One of the things you won't hear us use the term needs and desires. It's really about the community weighing in as to, you've been here, have you managed your traffic flows well? Have you been found selling to children or underage or non-licensed or prescribed patients coming in? Have you acted responsibly within the community? I'll tell you, there are some communities or dispensaries who've integrated themselves very well in the communities. They become good corporate and community partners. They have become, they've contributed to neighborhood organizations and helped put on neighborhood events. They have been there. I've gone to some of these neighborhoods. So have you, I'm sure, where dispensaries have found themselves integrated as stakeholders. What we're looking for are those who have not necessarily held up their end of the bargain and have operated less than honorable efforts under the MMD banner.
Thank you.
You had a question?
I did. Thank you,
Judy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just had a question when you were talking about, you didn't say buffer, but the buffer zones from schools
Right.
and other retail outlets. Did you consider child care and recreation centers?
I think we figured out while we did MMD policies that child care centers fell pretty much under the concept of schools. And I think I remember that very clearly. Councilwoman Boygan in particular,
Right.
former Councilwoman Boygan, really pushed that issue. I believe I left without us ever resolving recreation centers. And if I can be corrected though, but I don't know if we never resolved that question with rec centers. It might be something we take up this time around.
Okay. Thank you.
And maybe clean up some of those. I mean, one of the things we're going to have to do, and I touched on it, is that we're going to have to look at the MMD ordinance and determine, one, if we allow it to continue to live after the implementation of, after the 2-year phase-in process, is it necessary? And just have those kind of conversations, and two, if we make any changes to the law that's on the book.
Okay, thank you.
Jeannie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our federal leaders have not been reluctant to speak out on controversial issues, even right here in Denver. What are we doing to try to get them to speak out on this one so we know if we're going to be wasting 2 years of time?
Well, I appreciate that, Councilwoman. I'm certainly hopeful and expect that within 2 years we certainly will hear from the federal government. And I do know that the Attorney General Suthers as well as Governor Hickenlooper have both made an appeal. In light of those appeals, I didn't make a formal appeal, but I can tell you that I've spoken with the White House on 2 occasions asking when we can expect an appeal, some information from the federal government. and there's no definitive time in which that's coming down. All I've been told is they are absolutely discussing it internally.
Let me add, Mr. Mayor, if we keep getting audits like this, we are sure as hell going to hear from the federal government.
Absolutely.
Because this was an embarrassment. And if I'm in the Attorney General's office in D.C., I think it would raise some eyebrows.
Absolutely.
Can we indeed control this substance? Let me have a question here, and that is, I'm looking at the political calendar and the 2-year phase-in that you want. That puts it, if we're looking at something in July, that puts this decision, it will shift it to a new council, basically, because about half of us term limited.
Term limited, sure.
Do we need to kind of rethink that? Because I don't know if I want, frankly, no offense, but greenhorns dealing with this issue. It is so complex, as we've heard today. Quite serious. So complex. If
It
we
is.
have the institutional knowledge. Now, some people would say, I don't want to deal with it again.
Right.
But I'm just thinking, just think about that.
And you all, you're debating these, so please couch these as recommendations from my administration, what we believe are wise recommendations for us all to consider. And it is complex. And quite frankly, if we could do a 5-year phase-in period in order to allow for really a good due diligence on this issue, we might look at it. We chose 2 years because we thought it'd be adequate enough time to really look at this issue. I don't think it stops for. It doesn't mean that you can't stop at 1 year and 6 months and say how are we doing and
Right.
evaluate it at that point and make some alterations. But yeah.
Okay, let's go Jeannie and then Chris and then Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Mayor, thank you for laying out some very clear areas of concern that we can then elaborate on. I don't want to try to get down into the details of how we go at each
Right.
category today, but earlier before you came in, and actually almost before I came in, there was public comment, and one of the speakers said I had quoted a number of dispensaries. What I did, and my colleagues may have been copied on this, I'll pass these around, was ask for a survey similar, or a count similar to what I asked for in 2009, 2010, in terms of, we've got crime statistics in one of your
Right.
early meetings,
Yeah, that was
Councilman,
the
but this
first
is
one.
in terms of comparing dispensaries over the past 4 years to rather random choices, but banks, liquor stores, pharmacies. And I really support what you're saying about having the money for our resources. Our police forces are already stressed.
Absolutely.
You also pointed out that it's a cash industry, which banks are as well. So it's logical that it attracts crime. That's
Sure.
where the money is. And I think that has a big impact on our neighborhoods and on the spacing issue that Councilman Lopez supported you on. So I'm using this sort of dual purpose to say I really
Sure.
appreciate your being here and also to explain what a speaker was talking
good.
about earlier.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here. It's a real privilege to have you back in this room. I just wanted to thank you for what you just did. I know that your own personal convictions may lie in a different place than what you've articulated, or maybe where others of us are. And I mean, we certainly agreed on a lot of things, but disagreed on some things when we were wrestling the medical marijuana to the ground. But I really appreciate you taking this on with the seriousness that you have, and I think threading a needle between your own personal conviction, your commitment to children, families, neighborhoods, and at the same time to the will of the voters, and respect to the people that have invested blood, sweat, and tears in this brand new industry. So I don't know. I appreciate you. I'm sure we'll disagree on some things as we
Sure.
wrestle this to the ground.
Sure.
But I really appreciate you threading the needle in the way that you have.
Well, I appreciate that, Councilman Nevin. And let me just say to all of you, because I've talked to quite a few of you as I've kind of tried to formulate my opinion, and I'll give you a peek into the mayor's office. If we've had this conversation 4 months ago, 5 months ago, it would have been Denver, opt out, don't go. From me, this is the mayor speaking, and it's because of the sage advice and wisdom of the staff to say, step back and breathe and listen. And, because of my personal convictions and what I really, truly think about the impact that marijuana has on our communities, or just substance abuse in general. But I'm surrounded by good people who want to make sure that we as a city don't have a knee-jerk reaction to policy, but that is good policy, public policy going forward. And it's not just centered on our personal beliefs, but it's centered as well on what's in the best interest and what have the people said.
Debbie, you get the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here. So my question has to do with whether or not we have had any, and this really is more directed to Tom, any current establishments closed, and do we think we are adequately staffed to deal with today's operations, and then if we're dealing with something other than conversion, would that require additional staffing to just take care of all of that? So, you want to speak to that?
Of course, thank you. The answer to the first question is that yes, we have closed them. Remember David Broadwell's presentation, as he has said a number of times. This is a strange industry in that it was here and operating, and then the regulations came down. And so, yes, I don't have a figure in my head, but we have those that were operating, which we then denied. Either we or the state denied the licenses for, then they are closed. And we have done, I cannot tell you what that number is. Then
So those were primarily for regulatory reasons and not violations of operation?
Correct. I don't know of any, I'm not saying that there weren't any, but I don't know of any off the top of my head where they were licensed, and then because they were violating something in the Denver Municipal Code that they were shut down. The others, it may be that they were operating, and then a common one was that they were up and operating, and then the regulations came down that they couldn't have felony records, criminal records.
Some had to move because of the federal law, saying if they were within a proximity of a school, they had to leave.
Exactly. So those, we didn't shut those down,
Right.
but a year and a half ago, the U.S. Attorney, John Walsh, sent letters to all of those that were within 1,000 feet of schools and told them they had to shut down. And of those, of those, I think it was something like 2 or 3 moved. A handful in Denver just shut down, and others merged. As far as the staffing, the second part of your question, this is where I get to make the plea, not just on behalf of myself, but to back up what the mayor said. It is not just because he can fire me tomorrow, but because we absolutely need it. As I got to confess to you earlier today, we're not staffed to handle the load that we have right now. Again, our staff was cut 20% before medical marijuana came into place, and we even had to make cuts more recently, including in last year's budget. We are not prepared for the incoming, so the implementation of Amendment 64, we would have to staff up for, and it all depends on what exactly we need to do.
Peggy's got one really quick question.
Not a question, just a comment. I've heard 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, but I've heard no. I mean, we've been in this medical thing, and I don't know. Could you look at that and say, is 2 years sufficient? Can we get any information, enough information? Would you look at that time frame, please?
Yeah, and again, just let me reiterate, in terms of the term greenhorn, we were all greenhorns at one time. And you know what it was like coming into this job. We had no idea what it was going to be like. In fact, 2 years, and that would hit right at when they're coming out of the chute.
Mm-hmm.
And man, what an issue to hit.
Right.
Slap you right in the face.
Right.
I think I'd extend it to 3 or something, but 2 is either before we're out or at least a year or so after. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks to the
Mr. Chair.
committee. Our next meeting is May the 13th. I encourage you to take tours, as I mentioned last Monday, of the dispensary or grow facility before we meet again. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.